6:45 in the morning, Quincy Avenue, Cleveland. January 1932. The temperature inside the forge room pushes past 105 degrees, despite the Ohio winter clawing at the windows. The sound you hear isn't stamping presses anymore, it's silence. The kind of silence that fills a factory designed for 3,000 workers when only 200 remain. Peerless Motor Car Company built automobiles that presidents drove, cars that competed with Packard and Pierce Arrow, vehicles so refined that wealthy buyers waited months for delivery. For 33 years, the name Peerless stood for American luxury. The 3 Ps of Motordom: Packard, Pierce Arrow, Peerless. The holy trinity of premium automobiles. Then the luxury market collapsed, and Peerless faced a choice that no other car company in American history had ever confronted. Close forever, or transform into something completely different. They chose beer. By October 1933, the factory that built V16 engines was brewing Peerless beer. The assembly lines that carried $10,000 automobiles now moved bottles at 400 per minute. The craftsmen who hand-fitted doors were learning fermentation chemistry, and Cleveland watched one of its proudest industrial achievements admit that making beer was more profitable than making cars. Was this pragmatic survival, or the most humiliating surrender in automotive history? If you're fascinated by the untold stories of America's luxury automakers and the desperate choices they made when everything collapsed, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me which forgotten car company you want me to investigate next. Your support makes these deep dives possible. Let's begin. Peerless didn't start with automobiles. The company began in 1869 as a clothes wringer manufacturer. That's how far back this story reaches, to an era when America still wrung water from laundry by hand, when factories were powered by steam engines, when the internal combustion engine existed only in experimental form in European workshops. The founder was a British immigrant named Alva Brown. He understood something essential about American manufacturing in the post-Civil War era. People needed basic tools that improved daily life, and whoever built those tools cheaply and reliably would profit. Clothes wringers qualified. Brown's company prospered modestly through the 1870s and 1880s, employing a few dozen workers in a small Cleveland factory, building products that nobody celebrated but everyone needed. In 1890, Brown's company began diversifying. They built bicycles, the hot new technology of the 1890s. The bicycle craze swept America like nothing before it. Middle-class families suddenly wanted bicycles. Working men saved for months to buy bicycles. Young women scandalized their parents by riding bicycles in pants instead of dresses. The Peerless Manufacturing Company rode that wave, building sturdy, reliable bicycles that sold well in the Midwest. But bicycles were a transitional technology. By 1900, anyone paying attention could see that the future belonged to motorized vehicles. Horse-drawn carriages were giving way to automobiles. The few thousand cars on American roads in 1895 had become tens of thousands by 1900. The question wasn't whether automobiles would dominate, it was who would build them. In 1900, Peerless built its first automobile, a single-cylinder machine with chain drive and tiller steering. It was crude, unreliable, and proved that the company had no idea how to build cars. But it was a start. More importantly, it attracted the attention of someone who did know how to build cars: Lewis P. Moores. Moores was a young engineer with genuine talent. He'd worked for several early automotive companies, learning engine design and chassis engineering. When Peerless hired him in 1901, he immediately began improving everything. He designed a new 4-cylinder engine that produced reliable power. He created a shaft drive system that eliminated the problematic chains. He engineered a chassis that could handle rough roads without shaking apart. The 1902 Peerless reflected Moore's improvements. It was a real automobile, well-built, reasonably reliable, competitive with anything produced in America. More importantly, it established the philosophy that would define Peerless for the next 3 decades. Build expensive cars for wealthy customers who valued quality over price. The decision to focus on luxury wasn't accidental. Moores and the company's new president, James Packard, no relation to the Packard brothers, understood that competing with Henry Ford on price was suicidal. Ford was already demonstrating that mass production could drive costs to levels that hand-built manufacturers couldn't match. Luxury was different. Wealthy buyers wanted exclusivity, craftsmanship, performance. They'd pay premium prices for cars that announced their status. Peerless pursued that market aggressively. The company established a factory complex on Quincy Avenue in Cleveland, a sprawling industrial site that eventually covered over 22 acres. The buildings weren't architectural masterpieces. They lacked Albert Kahn's elegance or the grandeur of Packard's Detroit facilities. But they were substantial. Reinforced concrete construction, multiple stories for vertical production flow, large windows for natural light, and enough space to build complete automobiles from raw castings to finished vehicles. By 1905, Peerless was building cars that competed directly with Packard and Pierce Arrow. The Peerless Green Dragon, a racing variant, set speed records and won high-profile races. Barney Oldfield, America's most famous race driver, piloted a Peerless to victories that made front-page news. Racing success translated to showroom credibility. Wealthy buyers who had never raced their cars still wanted vehicles that could win races if asked. The phrase, the 3 Ps of motordom, emerged around 1910. Packard, Pierce Arrow, Peerless, the triumvirate of American luxury automobiles. To own one was to announce that you'd arrived. Doctors drove them, lawyers drove them, successful businessmen drove them. The cars cost $4,000 to $8,000 when average annual income was around $700. They were meant to be expensive. Exclusivity was the point. Peerless production peaked around 1911-1912, building approximately 3,000 cars annually. That doesn't sound like much compared to Ford's hundreds of thousands, but it was exactly right for the luxury market. Peerless employed about 3,000 workers at peak, 1 worker per car. The ratio reflected the hand labor involved. Bodies were largely assembled by craftsmen who fitted panels individually. Engines were machined to tolerances tighter than mass-market manufacturers attempted. Interiors were upholstered with leather hand-stitched by specialists who'd trained for years. The factory on Quincy Avenue developed a particular character that workers remembered decades later. The buildings were hot in summer. Furnaces and forges running constantly made Cleveland summers unbearable. They were cold in winter despite the heat from metalworking because the older buildings weren't insulated well. The noise was constant but different from Ford's thundering assembly plants. Peerless built slower, with more handwork, with craftsmen consulting each other about how to solve particular problems. The wages were good, 20% above what Ford paid in Detroit, competitive with Packard. Peerless understood that skilled workers couldn't be rushed or easily replaced. You didn't train a master metal finisher in 6 weeks. You developed that skill over years. The company invested in its workforce and expected loyalty in return. Most workers gave it. Turnover was low. Fathers worked at Peerless, then brought their sons in when positions opened. World War I transformed Peerless like every American manufacturer. The company stopped building civilian automobiles and started building military trucks. Over 11,000 Peerless trucks served in the American Expeditionary Force in France. The trucks were overbuilt by military standards, crafted with the same attention to detail as the luxury cars. They were also more expensive than competitors' trucks, but the military didn't care during wartime. They needed vehicles that wouldn't break down in mud and combat conditions. Peerless delivered. The war years were profitable. Peerless earned money on government contracts without facing civilian market competition. The factory ran at capacity. Workers pulled overtime. The company's financial position strengthened. When the war ended in 1918, Peerless had cash reserves, a skilled workforce, and plans to dominate the post-war luxury market. Those plans failed almost immediately. The post-war recession of 1920-1921 hit luxury automakers hard. Wealthy buyers, spooked by economic uncertainty, stopped purchasing new cars. The Peerless dealer network, never as extensive as Packard's, struggled to move inventory. Cars sat in showrooms for months. The company cut production, laid off workers, slashed prices. Nothing helped enough. But Peerless survived the recession. By 1923, the economy had recovered and luxury car sales rebounded. Peerless introduced new models with modern features: 4-wheel brakes, 6-cylinder engines, elegant coachwork by custom bodybuilders. The cars were beautiful, well-engineered, competitive with anything Packard or Lincoln offered. The problem was that competitive with Packard wasn't enough anymore. Packard had pulled ahead. Packard's dealer network was national. Their advertising budget dwarfed Peerless's. Their production volume, around 25,000 cars annually by the mid-1920s, gave them economies of scale that Peerless couldn't match. Pierce Arrow faced similar challenges but had Studebaker's backing after 1928. Peerless was independent, undercapitalized, slowly losing market share. The company's response was desperation disguised as innovation. 1929, Peerless announced plans to introduce a V16 engine, 16 cylinders, 462 cubic inches, designed to compete with Cadillac's V16 and Marmon's 16. The engineering was ambitious. The timing was catastrophic. The stock market crashed in October 1929, just as Peerless was finalizing V16 development. The luxury car market didn't just contract, it evaporated. Wealthy buyers who could have afforded new Peerless automobiles chose not to buy them. Conspicuous consumption became socially unacceptable. Driving a $10,000 car in 1930 when 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed marked you as either ignorant or callous. Peerless production collapsed. The company built 250 cars in 1929. In 1930, production fell to 740. In 1931, just 350. The Quincy Avenue factory, designed for 3,000 workers building 3,000 cars, employed maybe 200 people producing 1 car per day. The waste was staggering. Entire buildings sat empty. Machinery that could stamp body panels stood idle. The assembly line that had once moved continuously now operated a few hours per week. The V16 prototype was completed in 1931. It was magnificent, a technical achievement that proved Peerless engineers could compete with anyone. A massive engine producing over 170 horsepower, mounted in a chassis that weighed nearly 6,000 pounds. The car could reach 100 mph per hour effortlessly. The craftsmanship was flawless. Nobody bought it. Peerless built approximately 3 V16 automobiles, maybe 5. Records are unclear because the company was collapsing too rapidly to document much. The few that were built went to company executives or were used for promotion. The market for $10,000 automobiles in 1931 might as well have been the market for private yachts or diamond tiaras. Theoretically, some wealthy people could afford them. Practically, nobody was buying. By late 1931, Peerless faced terminal crisis. The company was losing money every month. Cash reserves were nearly exhausted. Banks wouldn't extend credit. The options were simple: close immediately and liquidate assets, or find some other use for the factory, some other product to manufacture, some way to keep the workers employed and the buildings generating revenue. That's when someone, history doesn't record exactly who, suggested beer. The idea wasn't as insane as it sounds. Prohibition was clearly ending. The 18th Amendment had been a disaster. By 1932, both political parties supported repeal. It was only a matter of time before alcohol became legal again. And when it did, there would be enormous demand for beer from Americans who'd been drinking illegal products for 13 years. Peerless had advantages. The company owned a large factory with excellent equipment. They understood chemistry. You don't build engines without understanding metallurgy and fluid dynamics. They had a skilled workforce that could be retrained. They had a brand name with positive associations. Quality, refinement, American craftsmanship, all of that could theoretically transfer to beer. The decision was made in early 1932. Peerless would stop building automobiles and start brewing beer as soon as Prohibition was repealed. The company would become the Peerless Corporation, dropping motor car from its name. The factory would be converted from automobile assembly to beer production. The workers would either adapt or find other jobs. The last Peerless automobile was built in June 1932, a V16 sedan, driven off the assembly line by a worker who'd been with the company since 1910. There was no ceremony, no celebration, just quiet acknowledgement that 33 years of automotive history was ending. The car was driven to company headquarters and parked. Eventually, it was sold to a collector. It still exists, one of the few surviving Peerless V16s, testament to what the company achieved right before it surrendered. The conversion to brewing happened quickly. Engineers who designed transmissions now calculated fermentation rates. Metal workers who'd shaped fenders now built brewing kettles. The assembly line that had carried automobile chassis was reconfigured to move bottles at 400 per minute. The smell changed from motor oil and paint to hops and yeast. Prohibition ended on December 5, 1933, when the 21st Amendment was ratified. Peerless beer went into production almost immediately. The company had prepared for months, stockpiling ingredients, training workers, designing labels. When legal beer became possible, Peerless was ready. The irony was noted by everyone. A luxury car company that had built some of America's finest automobiles was now brewing beer. The automotive press wrote obituaries disguised as news articles. Industry observers debated whether this was shrewd adaptation or humiliating defeat. Peerless executives insisted it was pragmatic business. Beer was profitable, cars weren't. Survival required flexibility. The workers had mixed feelings. They had jobs. That mattered more than anything in 1933 when unemployment exceeded 25%. But the pride of building Peerless automobiles was gone. Brewing beer wasn't shameful work, but it wasn't the same. The craftsmen who'd spent decades perfecting metal finishing or engine assembly now performed tasks that required less skill, paid less, and carried less prestige. Peerless beer sold reasonably well. The brand name helped. People remembered Peerless automobiles and assumed the beer would be equally high quality. The taste was fine, not exceptional, but competent. In a market flooded with new beers from companies scrambling to enter the post-prohibition market, Peerless held its own. But brewing was a different business than automobile manufacturing. The profit margins were thinner. The competition was fierce. Giant breweries like Anheuser-Busch and Schlitz had national distribution networks and advertising budgets that Peerless couldn't match. Regional breweries competed on local loyalty. Peerless occupied an awkward middle position, too small to compete. Nationally, too disconnected from local communities to dominate regionally. The company survived through the 1930s and 1940s. Peerless beer remained available in Ohio and surrounding states. Production wasn't huge, maybe 100,000 barrels annually compared to millions for the major breweries, but it was enough to keep the Quincy Avenue facility operating and several hundred workers employed. The automotive legacy faded quickly. By 1940, most Cleveland residents under 30 had never seen a Peerless automobile. By 1950, the company's history as a luxury car manufacturer was largely forgotten, except by automotive historians and collectors. Peerless meant beer now, not cars. The transformation was complete. The brewing operation continued until 1958, when Peerless Corporation was sold to the Carling Brewing Company. Carling kept the Quincy Avenue facility operating for a few years, producing Carling Black Label and other brands under Carling ownership. But the Peerless name disappeared from beer labels. The brand that had survived the transition from cars to beer didn't survive corporate acquisition. The factory closed section by section through the 1960s. Some buildings were sold to smaller manufacturers. Some were demolished. By 1970, most of the original Peerless complex was gone. What remained stood empty. Too old for modern manufacturing. Too contaminated for easy conversion. Too expensive to maintain. Cleveland's industrial decline accelerated through the 1970s and 1980s. The neighborhoods around Quincy Avenue deteriorated as jobs disappeared. The Peerless site became another Rust Belt ruin. Contaminated soil, crumbling buildings, broken windows, graffiti-covered walls. Urban explorers discovered it in the 1990s, photographing the decay, documenting what remained before it disappeared completely. The last significant buildings were demolished in the early 2000s. The site was eventually cleared and remains largely vacant today. No historical marker indicates that Peerless Motor Car Company once operated there. No plaque commemorates the workers who built some of America's finest automobiles. The history has been erased. Approximately 50 Peerless automobiles survive in museums and private collections. They're beautiful machines, testament to the craftsmanship that defined the company. A 1916 Peerless in good condition might sell for $60,000 to $100,000. The rare V16 models command higher prices, though few ever come to market. These aren't the most valuable American classics, but they're respected by collectors who appreciate engineering excellence and historical significance. What makes Peerless unique in automotive history isn't how the company failed. Lots of luxury manufacturers failed during the Depression. It's how they responded to failure. Every other high-end automaker either closed entirely or was absorbed by larger corporations. Only Peerless chose transformation. Only Peerless decided that brewing beer was preferable to closing. Forever. The decision was controversial then, and remains debated now. Some historians argue it was brilliant pragmatism. The company survived another 26 years by adapting to market reality. The workers kept jobs through the Depression. The factory remained productive. Survival counted for something. Others see it as the most humiliating surrender in automotive history. Peerless abandoned everything that made the company significant. The craftsmanship, the luxury positioning, the engineering excellence, all sacrificed to brew commodity beer. The company survived in name only. The substance was gone. Both perspectives have merit. Peerless did survive. The Quincy Avenue factory operated for decades longer than it would have if the company had closed in 1932. Hundreds of workers earned wages through the Depression and beyond. From a purely economic perspective, the decision to switch to beer was defensible, but something was undeniably lost. The pride of building Peerless automobiles couldn't transfer to brewing Peerless beer. The workers knew it, the company knew it, Cleveland knew it. One of the 3 Ps of Motordom became a footnote, remembered mainly for giving up on cars when things got hard. The question that haunts Peerless's story is whether the company could have survived as an automaker with different decisions. Should they have never attempted the V16? Should they have partnered with another manufacturer? Should they have introduced lower-priced models earlier? Could better management have saved the automotive operation? The economic historians say no. The luxury car market contracted 80% between 1929 and 1932. Nobody could survive that. Peerless's failure was inevitable once the Depression destroyed demand. Switching to beer was the only rational choice. The automotive enthusiasts disagree. Packard survived. Cadillac survived. Lincoln survived. These companies faced the same market conditions but found ways to endure. Peerless failed because management panicked, because they lacked the capital to weather the storm, because they chose the easy path instead of fighting for the automotive business. The truth is probably that both perspectives miss something essential. Peerless faced impossible choices with inadequate resources during the worst economic catastrophe in American history. They could close immediately, laying off all workers and admitting total defeat. Or they could try something desperate, convert to a completely different product, retain some workforce, survive in diminished form. They chose survival. Whether that was courage or cowardice depends on what you value. The workers who kept jobs through the Depression probably appreciated the decision. The craftsmen who'd spent decades building luxury automobiles probably felt betrayed. Both reactions were valid. What's certain is that the Quincy Avenue factory went silent eventually anyway. The beer business provided a stay of execution, not a pardon. By 1970, the buildings that had produced both Peerless automobiles and Peerless beer stood empty. By 2005, they were demolished. The outcome was the same, just delayed by 3 decades. Cleveland lost one of its proudest industrial achievements when Peerless stopped building cars. The city's reputation as a manufacturing center diminished. The jobs disappeared. The expertise scattered. The institutional knowledge of how to build luxury automobiles was lost. That knowledge couldn't be preserved by brewing beer. Different products require different skills. The transition meant the old skills died with the workers who possessed them. The Peerless story is ultimately about choices made under pressure, about companies facing extinction and deciding what they're willing to become to survive, about workers who needed jobs adapting to work they never imagined doing, about a brand name that meant excellence accepting that excellence wasn't profitable enough. The Quincy Avenue site is empty now, has been for years. The buildings are gone. The workers are dead. The cars are scattered in collections. The beer is forgotten. Nobody collects Peerless beer bottles the way they collect Peerless automobiles. What remains is a story about adaptation and surrender, about survival and loss, about the price of staying alive when your reason for existing has disappeared. Peerless Motor Car Company built luxury automobiles for 33 years. Then they brewed beer for 26 years. Then they disappeared completely. Which period defined the company depends on what you choose to remember. The automotive historians remember the cars. The business historians remember the adaptation. The workers who lived through both remember that neither lasted. That's the tragedy. Not that Peerless failed. Most companies fail eventually. The tragedy is that they succeeded brilliantly at building automobiles, then had to admit that success wasn't enough. That the market didn't care about excellence when nobody had money. That choosing beer over closure was rational, necessary, and still felt like defeat. The 3 Ps of Motordom became 2, Packard and Pierce Arrow. Peerless became a brewery, then became nothing. The luxury it represented ended. The craftsmanship it exemplified dispersed. The workers it employed scattered. And Cleveland learned what every industrial city eventually learns: that factories close, companies fail, and the choices you make when facing extinction are never good choices. Just choices between different kinds of loss. The Peerless factory is gone. The story remains. And the question lingers. Was switching to beer a triumph of adaptability, or an admission that they'd given up on everything that mattered? 70 years later, nobody can answer that definitively. We can only observe what happened and recognize that Peerless chose survival over pride, pragmatism over principle, and beer over cars. Whether that was the right choice depends on whether you value existing or meaning something. Peerless existed 26 years longer by brewing beer, but they stopped meaning what they'd meant. The workers had jobs but lost their craft. The company survived but lost its soul. And Cleveland watched one of its industrial jewels admit that making beer was easier than making excellence profitable. That's the story. That's the legacy. 33 years of building luxury, then a surrender disguised as adaptation, then silence. The factory is demolished. The brand is extinct. And the last Peerless automobile sits in a museum somewhere, evidence that Cleveland once built cars that competed with the world's finest, right up until the moment they decided it was easier to brew beer instead.